Welcome back to Quiberon History. In the last episode, we followed the men of the 10th Light Horse from the training grounds of Western Australia across the Indian Ocean and into the deserts of Egypt. Now their war was about to begin. By May 1915, the situation at Gallipoli had reached a breaking point. The soldiers at ANZAC Cove had been tested beyond expectation, exposed to constant fire, confined to narrow trenches, and fighting for grounds measured in yards. They needed relief, rest, and reinforcements. At first it was proposed that the light horse regiments would be sent forward in pieces, broken up and distributed among the infantry already holding the line. But this idea was abandoned. Instead, they would go as formed units. In early May, Brigadier Frederick Hughes, commanding the 3rd Light Horse Brigade, received his orders. His men were to prepare to move to Gallipoli. The decision brought with it an immediate and difficult reality. They would not be going as mounted troops. Each regiment was required to leave behind a portion of its men, those tasked with remaining in Egypt to care for the horses. For the rest, it meant something more personal. They were leaving behind the animals they had travelled with across continents, and with them a part of their identity. There were other changes too. The distinctive slouch hats marked with emu plume were to be left behind, replaced with the standard British sun helmet. A practical decision, but not a popular one. Some men chose to take their slouch hats with them anyway. Brigadier Hughes left Lieutenant Colonel Noel Brazier in command of the camp details, those who would remain behind. The rest prepared to move. On the 15th of May, the regiment marched out. Corporal Henry Foss of C Squadron wrote, "We marched out in rear of other regiments. Cheering, laughing, singing, and joking, we made our way to the railway station, cracking jokes as we passed the hospital with the wounded who lined the streets and windows." The carriages proved to be the old third-class cattle truck variety, which had been used on our trip from Port Turfic. Within an hour or so, all were aboard, and the train moved out for Alexandria. Sleep was almost impossible, but we did the best we could. Men were sleeping in every conceivable position, and all were glad when we pulled up beside the wharf at Alexandria just after daylight. By the afternoon of the 16th of May, the 10th Light Horse boarded their transport, the Lutzow, at Alexandria. At 5:30 p.m., the ship departed. They were on their way to Gallipoli. The Lutzow made its way across the Mediterranean towards the Gallipoli peninsula. On the evening of the 18th of May 1915, it arrived off Cape Helles. The war no longer distant, it was just over the horizon. Trooper Sid Lavezzi later described the moment. "As we drew to Cape Helles, we could see the flashes of shrapnel bursting over French and British lines, and later we could hear the boom, boom of the ship's guns, for they were bombing the big hill, Archie Baba. Now the boys were a bit excited, for it was the first real Dinkin War most of us had seen, and we began to realize what we had come for." The ship steamed in close to Cape Helles and dropped anchor near a line of battleships. Through the night, rifle fire crackled across the peninsula. At dawn, the bombardment resumed, each side pounding the other for all it was worth. Among the men of the 10th Light Horse, the mood shifted. Some sharpened their bayonets on grindstones, others checked their rifles in silence. They had arrived. On the afternoon of the 21st of May, at about 4:30 p.m., the orders came. The men began transferring from the Lutzow to the destroyers Cecilia and Chelmer. From there, they would make their final approach. Trooper Evan Bain later recalled, "On the evening of the 21st, we landed on the beach in small rowing boats manned by young sailors from the ships. They had a ton of guts." The final stretch to shore was exposed. Rowing boats low in the water, moving steadily towards a coastline under fire. There was no pause after landing, no time to gather. The men moved straight inland, up the steep ground above the beach. There they began to dig. Shallow dugouts carved into hard earth. Whatever shelter they could make before nightfall. That first night, the regiment was positioned in Mule Gully. Their strength now stood at 24 officers and 470 enlisted men. By late May 1915, the ANZAC position had hardened into a fragile and dangerous line. The beachhead was divided into 4 sections, each held by either the 1st Australian Division or the New Zealand and Australian Division. The right flank held by the Australians, the left by the ANZAC Division. A thin, uneven front stretched across steep ridges and narrow gullies, each position exposed, every moment observed. On the morning of the 23rd of May, the 10th Light Horse moved forward into Shrapnel Valley. They were assigned to 3rd Section, one of the most dangerous parts of the line. Here lay the key positions: Courtney's Post, Quinn's Post, and Pope's Hill. The conditions were relentless. Shell fire fell without warning, snipers watched every exposed inch of ground, and the trenches themselves were dangerously close, in some places less than 10 metres from the Turkish lines. Only days earlier, on the 19th of May, Turkish forces had launched a major assault across the front. It had failed, but the cost remained. Between the lines lay the dead, most of them Turkish, unburied, exposed. The heat quickly turned the battlefield into something far worse, a place marked not just by danger, but by the stench of decay. On the 24th of May, an armistice was declared. Men from both sides emerged from their trenches to bury their dead. By nightfall, the war resumed. That same night, around 100 men from A and B squadrons of the 10th Light Horse were sent forward. Their destination was Quinn's Post. They joined approximately 350 men of the 13th Battalion already holding the line. 2 days later, on the 26th of May, another 100 men from C Squadron were sent to occupy Pope's Hill. Together, these positions guarded the head of Monash Valley, a vital approach that, if lost, could unravel the entire ANZAC line. In the early hours of the 29th of May, just after 3 a.m, the silence was broken. A mine exploded beneath the ANZAC lines at Quinn's Post, destroying part of the trench and killing the men in the number 3 subsection. Moments later, Turkish troops surged forward, attempting to break into the shattered position. The response was immediate. Allied artillery fired shrapnel over Quinn's Post. At the same time, machine guns from Pope's Hill swept across no man's land, preventing reinforcements from reaching the fight. The attackers were trapped, caught between trenches, and under constant fire. By daylight, the situation was decided. Cut off and unable to withdraw, the remaining Turkish troops were forced to surrender. The cost, however, was significant. Australian casualties numbered 33 killed and 178 wounded. For the 10th Light Horse, 5 officers and 21 enlisted men were among the wounded. On the 30th of May, orders were issued for an attack. 60 men from the 10th Light Horse were selected, drawn from A and B squadrons under the command of Lieutenant Kidd. Their objective lay directly in front of the middle section at Quinn's Post. The targets were known as Works A and Works B, mine craters formed by earlier Turkish detonations. These positions had been incorporated into the Turkish line, connected by tunnels and reinforced as forward posts. They lay dangerously close, around 30 metres from the ANZAC trenches and roughly 150 metres apart from each other. The attack would not take place in isolation. Bombing operations were launched simultaneously along Quinn's Post, while machine guns on the flanks were tasked with suppressing Turkish rifle and machine gun fire. At 1:05 p.m, the men went over the top. Lieutenant Kidd later wrote, "We were totally unexpected, as the usual continuous rifle fire had almost ceased. However, before we arrived at our destination, it began to hum. Fortunately, we were already on the lip of the mine crater, which had been cleaned and prepared as an advanced post. Our grenades had already been hurled, and the Turkish posts were clearing out, some passing over the parapet, and others through a tunnel connecting up with the main trench. We captured one prisoner, who was not quick enough to slip away, and shot and bayoneted others. A count in the trench after its capture resulted in 22 men and myself. We were so congested that it was almost an impossibility to move." The initial assault succeeded. Work A was taken. 11 men managed to make it to Work B. What followed was hours of close-quarters fighting. Bombs were thrown back and forth across the cramped positions, often returned by hand due to their long fuses. By late afternoon, the situation began to turn. Around 5 p.m, the Turkish forces launched a determined counterattack against Work A. Under pressure from superior numbers, the light horsemen were forced to withdraw. At Work B, the men held on longer, but the outcome was inevitable. They were ordered to inflict as much damage to the position as possible and then pull back. At around 9 p.m. they withdrew. The casualties for the operation were 3 men killed in action, 2 more later dying of their wounds, and 29 wounded. On the 1st of June the regiment was relieved from duty in No. 3 section, but it was not until the 4th of June that most of the regiment finally marched out of Monash Valley. On the 1st of June the regiment was relieved from duty in No. 3 section, but it was not until the 4th of June that most of the regiment finally marched out of Monash Valley. Quinn's post was handed over to the New Zealand Infantry Brigade. For the men of the 10th Light Horse, their first experience of Gallipoli was over, but the cost of it would not be easily left behind. Thank you for watching my second video in my series on the 10th Light Horse. Please like and subscribe.